So going on with what happened in the dramatization, did you cringe as soon as the TA said, "Okay, ladies in the class"?
Yeah, I did. I have to say. I mean, that was, on one hand, it sounds heavy-handed, but I've had those experiences, so I know that that kind of thing happens. So, yeah, highlighting the women as women, drawing attention to their gender in front of everyone, yeah, that's a awkward moment.
And it plays back into stereotype threat, like what we were talking about, right?
Absolutely. Another chance to activate stereotype threat. Plus, it's unhelpfully stereotypical, right? So surely everyone who has a non-black or a non-blue pen could benefit from hearing it, right? Whether or not they're female. And for example, people might have pencils. So if you're using gender or race or any other social category to call out people, just leave it alone. Like, don't even go there. That's not to say that people have to leave those parts of themselves at the door, but it shouldn't be the defining characteristic of the relationship between the instructor and the student.
Exactly. I think he probably could have just said, my policy is only use blue or black pens or pencils, and just left it at that. There was no need to specifically mention the women in the class or anything like that.
That's right.
Even if it's just for like 2 seconds, like that one was. Like, it wasn't, something extended.
Absolutely. They don't need to be long. I actually remember being in a class and the instructor calling me dear. So it was, it was not even a second, right? I had made some kind of question or some kind of comment, and he called me dear, and that's all I could think about the entire rest of the class was how he called me dear. How dare he? How dare he presume that he had the right to call me that, and then in front of everyone else, I was incensed, and I heard nothing else of the class except for that. So, that's not what education's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be them learning physics. So, dropping all of that peripheral extraneous junk that in fact has nothing to do with the class and focusing everyone's attention on physics.
So now that we talk about James, when I was coming up with the idea for that interaction, that was largely based on my personal experience as an African American, and moments where I've seen African Americans or other underrepresented minorities put pressure on other people also in the minority group, and pressure to perform well and to go against whatever the stereotype is, to show people that this is just a stereotype. Not everyone in this group is like this, and you work extra hard to show people that you're not, in that box that the stereotype has tried to put them in. As a woman, have you ever had any, similar interaction where a woman was putting pressure on you or on someone else that was also a woman?
Sure, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but I want to address the race thing for a second. So I'm not just a woman, I'm a white woman, right? So as a white person, I know that I've learned to think that my race is background, that it's default, and that what I have I've earned through my own merit. But I also know that neither of these things are actually true or right. One of my participants in some of my research, he's a black man that I met at the National Society of Black Engineers. He told me about these kinds of interactions that you're describing, and he called them sunning, and emphasized how they actually mattered to him personally in order to amp up his game. So maybe Ernest does want to warn James, but he just said to everyone that they could use his pens, right? And maybe James had bought a pencil. So there's this presumption that Ernest is putting on James, that James is unprepared. And that may have racial relations at heart, even though Ernest is also black. So that sort of speaks to the whole, we do things to ourselves, as it were. We do things to our own groups. So because of my white privilege, I'm not expected to represent my racial group, and so I don't have to fear that my unpreparedness in coming to class is going to poorly represent my racial group. So my unpreparedness, I presume, because of white privilege, is a result of my own actions, and I know that my colleagues of color are not granted this same privilege, so I want to acknowledge that. However, I know that the research on gender indicates that both women and men activate implicit biases against women, that both women and men as groups hold low expectations against women, or hold up low expectations of women, or judge other women unfairly. And this is because we're not talking about sexism and racism as individual acts of meanness. This is because these things happen in the context of a set of social relations that we as groups hold and activate and turn into structural inequality. So absolutely, I've had the situation where other women have said, make sure that you do whatever it is, presuming that I might not, out of fear for being judged stereotypically by the majority group. So we're seeing really sort of powerful social relations activated here in the interaction between James and Ernest.
Great. Yeah. I mean, just because you're a member of a minority group doesn't exclude you from being insensitive from diversity with diversity, and it doesn't exclude you from doing things that make the classroom feel less inclusive, or to put pressure on other minorities to perform a certain way. And so, I really want to make the point that this is something that everyone has to be on guard for and aware of, and we all make careless remarks from time to time, or say a comment that's less inclusive, but the goal is to be aware of it and to consciously strive to use language that makes everyone feel like you said, that they have the opportunity to learn here, and that this is about learning and not being judged or put into a particular box.
Plus, once you make those mistakes, all of us are going to make mistakes. And once you make those mistakes, to own them and apologize for them. Like, it's not irrecoverable. You don't sort of damage the class irrecoverably. You can name what you did and describe why it was a mistake, why you shouldn't have said it, and apologize for it. That's totally acceptable to do. Like, don't try and paper over it once you do make mistakes, because we all do, because we're situated in a really complex set of social relations about where particularly gender and race structure our lived experiences. So they're going to come out, and then we can own them.
Yeah, and so now that you're talking about owning them, that also reminds me, another thing that I'm hoping is that, if someone who participates in this module, becomes more aware and ultimately more receptive to these kind of things, and if it's like, for example, you yourself, went up to that professor later and said, when you said dear, that really bothered me, instead of being someone who just laughs that off or just goes, well, that's that student's problem, that's their issue, they need to deal with that, going, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that would make you feel that way, and I will work hard in the future, to not say anything like that again, because clearly, like you said, that was all you could think about for the rest of the class. You didn't learn whatever it was you were supposed to learn in that class, because this deer was just in your mind, and so you can say, I don't want that to happen. I'm an educator. I want you to be focused on what I'm teaching you, and not on the words that I use to refer to you.
Right.
Okay. All right. So, when the TA was having trouble understanding that one student's accent, the student that had the question about the test, what are some of the things that you think he could have done differently there?
So students' accents can be barriers to understanding them, but an inclusive instructor can take on the burden of understanding the student and not make it the student's fault. So the student probably is aware of the challenges with their accent. I know I was when I lived in France and was trying to take my last year of high school in French. So despite this, they've taken up the courage to speak anyway and are just shot down by a person in power. That can be really damaging. So the TA's I'm just being honest is kind of a key marker that probably the TA is saying something inappropriate. So a better way to encourage someone to improve their English is to have them use it, right? To do whatever necessary to encourage them to speak with others publicly or privately, and then share other resources with them about how they can even talk with others. So I know our institution has conversation circles where you can go and talk with other international students about anything. You can go and get feedback about particular words. You can, there are all kinds of other resources that are available to help students deal with what is a functional and understanding issue. So this could be an opportunity for the TA instead to ask the student's name, like that would be a good place to start, right? Ask that the TA himself is pronouncing it correctly, or the instructor is pronouncing it correctly. Thank him for the question. Apologize for taking so long to understand him. And then don't presume necessarily that the student is planning to stay in the U.S. and therefore needs to overcome this. So really get to know the student before judging him through his accent. So an additional tool that instructors can use is called Think, Pair, Share. Maybe people have talked about it before. You give students an opportunity to think about how to answer a particular question, and then they talk about their answer with their neighbor, that's the pair. And then finally, once they've been able to think about it themselves and then talk about it with a neighbor, then you ask them to share with the entire group or provide an answer to the entire group. So this can really help international students as well as just shyer students, right? Because they've thought about what they want to say, they've practiced saying it out loud to someone, and then they have another chance to share it in front of the group. So finding ways to help folks who may be quieter for whatever reason to the opportunity to think through what they're going to say before they go forth and say it. The other thing I might suggest is, if you're having a really hard time understanding a student, is to ask them to write out the question. Sometimes students' written English grammar is better than their spoken English grammar and pronunciation and so forth, so just write down the question, that's fine. And then finally, if you use markers of accents to sort of identify, you presume something about someone because of their accent, you need to be cautious when doing that. Although they can be also helpful for thinking about what other cultural assumptions that you might make about a particular student, like the importance of education in a particular home culture, or the relationships students have with teachers, and the role of questions. I know that a third of my students in my first year class are from either China or India, and I know that the relationships that they have in their home countries that students have with instructors is very different from that relationship that we expect from domestic students. And so while I might use accent to encourage a student to improve their English, I can also use it as a way to presume that that they might not be as forthcoming with asking questions to begin with. And so really then honoring the times that they do come and ask questions, and making sure that that's not the time that I shoot them down for poor pronunciation or my own misunderstanding. So those are some other things to think about with this particular case.
Yeah, he can, say those same things in a more diplomatic and polite way, but also kind of one-on-one with the student instead of like right there in the middle of class while they're in the middle of a test.
Right. But the TA did do a good thing, which was afterwards. The TA did other good things too, but was noting that this was a confusing question and answering the confusing question for the entire class. So it's acknowledging that the question was a good one, right? So that's something that they could also have done with the student himself when he sort of figured out what the student was asking.
Okay, so he then ramps up the pressure once again, tells them about how hard it's going to be in the work they have to do outside of class. And, I feel like he's once again stepping into like this growth mindset and stereotype threat minefield. And in some places, it's almost as if he's really responding to previous students that he's had that might have said things like, I had no idea this class was going to be this hard and the work is so time consuming. Do you have any suggestions for how an instructor can make it clear that yes, this class is going to be challenging and difficult, but ultimately it'll be rewarding, and ultimately you're going to enjoy mastering the material? Right.
So it's really great to help students calibrate to some extent the workload, but then talk about what you yourself as an instructor found interesting or worthwhile. We know that one of the issues about STEM careers, in engineering there was a report a few years ago called Changing the Conversation, where the authors noted that when people talked about what engineers did as careers, it was about applying math and science. And when they talked about what doctors did, it was about saving lives and delivering babies. And doesn't that sound more interesting than applying math and science, right? But doing well in medicine also uses math and science, right? It's not like it doesn't use math or science. But they didn't lead with that, right? So temper the workload talk with the benefits talk. What is the benefit? What are the interests or great experiences or whatever that one has had, you as an instructor has had, or what you found interesting and rewarding about the material, to sort of balance the fact that it will be a lot of work, and you can do it, and it will be worthwhile, right? And also the instructor does offer help at this point, right? I think he reminds them that he's available on email and office hours, and use those as opportunities to, when you are having a tough time, come ask for help, because sometimes you may be investing time that could be shortcutted, if that's a word, just by asking a question and getting it answered, right? So talking about the benefits of actually putting in all of this work at the end of the day, and making sure that they feel like they have the resources to get through the tough times.
Yes, that's great. And I really like your point about saying, okay, this is what you're going to get out of this class. Because I feel like now that I think about it, the TA could have said something like, afterwards you'll be able to design, basic electronic circuits, and, you will understand more about, the technological world that we live in, which, runs largely on electricity, and, makes all these things we enjoy, like, TV and cell phones and whatnot, possible. He also, while he's ramping this up, he also does single out the oldest student in the classroom.
Presumptively the oldest student.
And so while the student, seems to enjoy the attention, and, he kind of compliments him and says, I know you're on top of your work and you get things done, and it's mainly these younger ones that I'm worried about. I feel like even though there's that compliment in there, like still singling out this older student and, making the younger students, feel excluded, it can look like you're playing favorites, it can, again, make them feel like, oh, because I'm young, maybe he perceives me as less likely to do well in this class because, I don't have the same focus or determination as this older student or something. So, he's trying to, make the point that, whatever the free time that you might have had before, you may no longer have as much free time, and you may not be able to participate in all the stuff you used to do. But there's got to be a way to make that point, without making particular students feel excluded or singling out any particular student, right?
Absolutely, and just talking about it as coming from his own experience could be a good way of addressing that, right? Is saying, when I came, this was my expectations, and I found that I needed to shift those expectations, and that I had the resources then to go do that. But I might have had a tough time to start with until I started changing how I prioritize time, right? You are the expert of your own experience, so talking about it from your own perspective rather than presuming that you know what others' perspectives are is probably a better route to go. Like, even that one student, it's pretty presumptive that the instructor knows how the student spent his time. I guess they had the relationship from the previous class. But that doesn't mean that student is going to behave in exactly the same way in this new class. So that's an additional sort of, there's that cognitive load of impression management thing again, right? This student who's being singled out because he looks older than the other student doesn't necessarily mean he is. Now is wondering if all of these interactions is because they had this previous relationship in the other class, or because he looks older, or whatever it is. And so just leaving aside places that you want to single out individuals, even if it's to sort of lighten the tenor of the class and make a joke, usually probably best to leave out. You can maybe be self-deprecating and make a joke at your own expense, but I'd leave aside the ones about other folks. And in addition, I'm looking at the video, I was not actually sure how the student was experiencing, but there's an idea called spotlighting, which is the idea that people who are have their heart in the right place and want to make things better for underrepresented students of some kind are trying to call them out and various things in order to help them more, but the spotlight on them can be challenging as well, right? They can't recede into the background like everyone else does. Students who are from underrepresented groups are both hyper visible and invisible, right? They are the only sometimes in their class, but also they get overlooked in favor of majority folks. So trying to temper the ways that you interact with those onlys, whoever they are, however they are the only, is probably going to be a more inclusive approach than trying to single folks out in order to help them.
Okay, right at the end of the video, the TA assumes that everyone in the class is a physics major, and of course you should never assume that all the students in the same class are the same major, or even coming from the same academic background. Clearly, different students will have different amounts of preparation for the course. But do you kind of agree that anytime you find yourself making statements like, "I'm sure you're all familiar with," or "I know you've all seen this before," you're probably making at least one person in the classroom feel left out because it is in no way obvious to them. They haven't seen it before. They're not familiar with it. So in those moments, like, what's something you could probably say instead there?
Well, sometimes you could say some of you might. Bringing in some doubt is always good, and not being homogenizing about all of the students or none of the students, but talking about some of the students, talking again about your own experiences, talking about experiences of students from the past. So last year I had the experience of that all of my students were physics majors, and we found out that they all knew about this thing because that happened, right? So you can hedge if you're trying to make claims about groups. You can hedge, and that's something that can improve the trustworthiness of your own claims. Right, because it's awfully presumptuous that you know all of those students' experiences. Now this instructor had, I don't remember, a dozen students maybe.
Yeah, about that.
But in the context of my 120 person class, there is going to be nothing. The only thing that all of them will have experienced is that none of them will have experienced the same thing, right? Yeah. It is only about all of you, probably, mostly, whatever, and bringing in acknowledging some doubt and some room for variation.
So some of you might would be a much better route to go than all of you or everyone. Okay, exactly. Because ultimately, right, the role of the teacher is to, aid in navigating whatever difficulty there is, and, not just kind of saying, well, that's difficult, good luck, or, this is obvious, so if you don't get it, sorry. Which is, kind of basically what he says at the end to that student that was, an anthropology major, and now she's a physics major. Like, he's just like, whoa, that's a big change. Good luck with that. That's kind of the way he approaches it. But, is there some way, like, instead of saying, whoa, like, that's unbelievable, I'm not sure how you're going to do, some way he could respond to that where, he not only encourages them to, pursue their curiosity in his subject, right? He should be excited that someone wants to, change to his field of study, but also, leverage that diversity because she's going to bring, different perspectives to the classroom. She might, have different approaches to problem solving as opposed to someone who's always, done physics, and so she might bring some really interesting perspective to the class, right?
Absolutely, and so you see sort of the activation of a new kind of stereotype threat here, right? That we have not just a student, but a woman student who's transferring in from anthropology. And there's really no need to reinforce the bias that physical scientists might have against the social scientists as less challenging or worthy, and making those kinds of comments in the situation of the class is making it okay for all of those students to have that attitude, and that's not something that we think makes a very inclusive classroom. So, welcoming the student, and again, being welcoming to everyone. If anyone is coming from a context where you feel a little shaky about your background, come talk to me, we'll see what we can do. I mean, it's the instructor's job to teach all of the students, right? Not just the students who already are doing well enough that they would probably do well enough on their own. It's the instructor's job to identify those folks who need particular help, to help them, as well as the folks who already have had the resources to be able to be successful in the class. So use it as an opportunity to demonstrate, model appropriate inclusivity amongst the other students, as well as making that student feel welcome.
Yeah, and what you just said reminds me of different things that the TA did and how the TA could have done it differently in order to create a more inclusive atmosphere. And I really appreciate the different resources and things that you listed, because I can just imagine these are going to be, great links to have up with the video so that students who are interested in learning more about these different things like Think, Pair, Share can then go see what's available, what resources are available on the internet to help them integrate this into their classroom.